1892. The year was heavy with silence. The air carried the weight of a century about to turn, and in a dim corner of history, there rests a black and white portrait of a boy at first sight. It is nothing more than another stiff Victorian photograph. A child dressed neatly in a sailor suit. Every line of fabric pressed, every button fastened as if a parent had prepared him for something important. His hair parted perfectly. Each strand combed with care, frozen in the rigid discipline of the era. His lips pressed tight, not in shyness, but in resistance, as though words hovered there. Words he refused to give away. And yet none of this is what unsettles you. It is the eyes that stop you. The eyes that refuse to be ignored. They are not the eyes of a child. They are too old, too deep, too knowing. They stare, not at the camera, not at the photographer, but directly through time itself into you. And for a moment you feel as though you have become the subject, and he, the observer, and it is here that the unease begins for you. Realize those eyes do not simply look. They accuse. They whisper. They demand. Imagine holding this portrait in your hands. The edges cracked with age. The paper faintly curling, the smell of dust and forgotten places rising from it. You turn it under the light, expecting innocence, expecting fragility. But the boy meets your gaze with something else, something cold and heavy, and you cannot look away. You try to convince yourself it is only the limitations of old photography, the long exposures that made children appear serious. But then you notice the stillness of his pupils and how they seem to shift ever so slightly, as if adjusting to follow your movement, as if they refuse to let you go. And when the room around you grows quiet, when the ticking of the clock fades, when your own breath seems louder than it should, you will swear that his eyes have widened just a fraction. You blink and they are still again. But the damage is done now. The thought clings. What if the portrait is not static? What if the portrait watches? The deeper you stare, the stronger the pull becomes. Your thoughts begin to tangle. You imagine the room. He sat in, the photographer adjusting the lens the way the boy refused to smile, the way he sat stiff, as though he knew the camera was more than glass and metal. Perhaps he knew it was a trap. Perhaps he knew the moment would not just capture his face, but something hidden behind it. And when you realize this possibility, the photograph no longer feels like a memory. It feels like a cage. You picture a candle flickering in a dark room. The portrait resting on a wall, shadows shifting across his pale face. One moment his lips seem to soften, the faint trace of a smile. The next moment they tighten further into a grim line. One moment the eyes appear distant. The next they are locked onto you with an intensity that makes your chest tighten, and you cannot be certain whether the changes are real or born from your own mind, but the fear feels real enough. And then comes the whisper of thought that the photograph does not ask who you are. It asks what you hide. It asks what secrets you carry, and if you stare too long, if you let the gaze hold you, it will strip those secrets away, lock them inside its frame where the boy already waits. Not a child, but something else. Something that has been looking out for more than 100 years. People have spoken of this photograph. Those who have seen it describe the same pull. They say the boy does not let you turn away. They say at night footsteps echo faintly in rooms where the portrait hangs, small footsteps. The weight of a child crossing old wooden floors. They say breaths brush against the ear in the silence of midnight. And when the startled victim turns, they find no one. Only the portrait with eyes that appear a shade more alive than before. And there are those who confess to hearing a voice, not with their ears, but in the hollow of their mind. A soft whisper repeating, "I know, I know, I know," until the words are no longer separate thoughts but a command. And those who hear it too long change. They drift into silence, They withdraw from the world until one night they vanish entirely, leaving nothing but the portrait and a lingering chili. You realize then that this is not simply a picture. It is a door. A door first opened in 1892, a door that is never closed, and every time someone locks eyes with the boy, the door opens wider, pulling them in, drawing them to a place unseen. A place where the child waits with his ageless eyes. So when you see this portrait, remember, it is not paper and ink. It is not memory and history. It is a gaze. It is a snare. And the longer you look, the closer he comes, until you can almost hear the shift of fabric, the faint creak of floorboards, the hush of breath beside your ear. And by the time you turn to look, it will be too late, for he will already be standing there. 4. A year when the farmhouse in Vermont finally gave in to time. The roof sagged until it broke. The walls leaned until they crumbled, and what had once been a place of warmth and family stood only as a shell of dust and wood rotting into the soil. Yet it was in the attic of that ruin that a box was found. And it was not an ordinary box. It was small and worn with rusted hinges, and a lid that groaned when forced open, and inside there was no treasure, no gold, no heirloom of beauty. Instead, there were brittle letters, the kind written on paper so thin and so old that the ink had bled into ghosts of words, broken toys with eyes missing and limbs cracked, things no child had touched in decades. And at the very bottom, buried beneath these fragments of forgotten life, lay the photograph, the same boy, the same sailor suit, the same hair parted perfectly, and the same lips pressed tight. And when the light fell across the image, the eyes once again revealed themselves, and whoever held that picture must have felt it. The coldness, the weight, of being seen, not like looking at a child, but like confronting something that remembered you before you were even born. And on the back, in ink so dark it had eaten into the paper, were written only 2 words. He knows. Imagine the feeling of those words. Not he knows your name, not he knows a secret, but simply he knows, leaving everything open and nothing safe. He knows what you have done. He knows what you will do. He knows the things you have buried in your own attic, the sins, the shame, the memories you thought no one could ever touch, and the chill creeps into your spine, because how can a photograph know anything? How can a picture speak? But those who found the box did not laugh. They did not toss it aside, because the air in that attic was heavy. The silence was unnatural, and though the farmhouse was collapsed and broken, the attic felt too alive, too watchful, and they swore when they carried the box down the stairs that the photograph vibrated faintly against the wood, as if it wanted to move, as if it resisted being touched. Nights passed, and the family who stumbled upon this relic began to feel strange things. The house they brought it to seemed different. The doors creaked open, though the wind was still the toys from. The box shifted slightly, as though someone had been playing with them, and the brittle letters scattered across the floor in patterns like someone had knelt down and rearranged them while no one was looking. But the photograph never changed, or rather it never admitted to change. Yet one member of the family insisted the eyes were not the same from one night to the next. The youngest daughter said sometimes the lids were heavy, as though half shut. Other times they were wide, as if in alarm. And once she whispered, trembling, that the boy had tilted his head slightly, and when her parents scolded her for frightening herself, she cried that she was not lying. She swore the boy was following her through the house. She swore she felt small footsteps behind her as she went to bed, and then the whispers began, faint at first, like the rustle of paper, but growing clearer until they formed words. No one wanted to hear, sometimes in the walls, sometimes in the attic, sometimes directly behind them in the dark, and always the same phrase, he knows. The photograph sat quietly on the table, its paper yellowing, its corners curled, but its eyes deepening, until the girl refused to stay in the same room with it, And then one night, she was gone. Her room empty, her window open, though the snow outside showed no prints, no marks at all, only cold, untouched ground. Her bed neatly made, except for the photograph lying upon the pillow. And this time, when her parents lifted it, they found the boy's eyes wide open and staring as though he had finally woken from a long slumber. The police searched, but they found nothing. No trace of struggle, no trail to follow. They asked about the photograph, but the family hesitated, ashamed to confess what they feared. They locked it away in a drawer. Yet still at night the words returned. In that same soft voice, he knows. He knows, he knows. Until they too began to question their own secrets. Until they too wondered what it was that the boy had seen. The farmhouse where the box had been discovered was burned a year later. No one ever learned who set the fire, and no one ever rebuilt. But the photograph survived, as if fire itself refused to claim it, as if destruction had no power over it. And so it traveled from hand to hand, from family to stranger, each time leaving behind unease and silence, and always the reminder that it had been hidden in a box, buried under toys and letters, and still it had waited patiently until someone opened the lid, and so the photograph lives on, not in albums, not in museums, but in whispers, in warnings, in rumors that spread like smoke. People say the box was never truly closed. They say the attic still holds the sound of a child's breathing. And if you ever come across a photograph marked with the words, "He knows," you must look away, because if you do not, if you allow the gaze to reach you too deeply, then the boy will not simply watch. He will follow. And once he follows, there is no door you can close, no window you can lock that will keep him out. The family at first treated the box as nothing more than junk pulled from a rotting attic. They laughed at the brittle letters, they tossed the broken toys aside. They muttered about the wasted space and how they had carried useless weight into their home. But the youngest daughter did not laugh. She was drawn again and again to the photograph. The boy in the sailor suit, his lips tight, his hair perfect, and his eyes darker than any eyes she had seen before. She told them the picture was wrong. She told them his head moved just a little. Each time she looked as though the boy was shifting angles, as though he was searching for the best way to see her. They dismissed it. They scolded her for frightening herself. They told her that photographs do not move. Photographs are frozen forever. But in the nights when the house creaked and the lamps dimmed, she whispered that the boy was tilting his head, not in the stiff posture of a child, but in the curious motion of a predator. And she said it softly, trembling as though she was afraid the boy could hear her. Imagine the child lying awake, the photograph tucked in a drawer down the hall. Yet still she felt the gaze pressing into her skin. She turned to the wall, but the pressure did not fade. She pulled the blankets high over her face, but the weight of those eyes settled deeper until she imagined them in the corner of her room. Not flat, not paper, not still, but standing just beyond the reach of the candlelight, head tilted in that same silent question. During the day she tested it. She pulled the photo out. She placed it on the table. She circled around it, slowly, watching carefully, and she swore that no matter what side she moved to, the boy adjusted with her. His chin slightly angled, his eyes always locked. No frame should have allowed that. No image should have tracked her. Yet it did, and the more she tried to prove it, the more certain she became, until she screamed that he was following her, until her parents slapped the photo face down on the wood and told her to stop. But the damage was done. The seed of fear had rooted itself. She began to avoid her own reflection in mirrors, afraid she might not be alone in the glass. She stopped sleeping through the night, waking again and again, certain that the sound of light footsteps brushed across her floorboards, and when she dared to glance at her dresser, she imagined she saw the picture lying there, even though her father had locked it away in a box. The parents grew weary. They said she was imagining things. They said she was inventing stories, yet they too began to feel uneasy in their own home. The mother caught herself closing the drawer with trembling hands, refusing to meet the child's gaze in the photo. The father once thought he heard the faint scratch of fingernails against wood coming from inside the box where the picture lay. And though he told no one about it, his silence grew heavier. The girl alone continued to insist that the head was moving. Not in leaps, not in sudden shifts, in delicate, almost invisible angles, so that only someone who stared long enough would notice. And she did stare because she could not resist, because something in those eyes commanded her to return, again and again, as though her fear was not her own but his, as though he was guiding her deeper into him. Neighbors later said they remembered her looking pale. They remembered her standing at the edge of the yard at dusk, staring toward the house windows as if someone inside was calling to her. They said she flinched when they touched her shoulder, that she muttered under her breath words too soft to understand. But one phrase repeated again and again. He knows. He knows, he knows. And the question grew inside her. What does he know? Does he know my name? Does he know where I will be tonight? Does he know the thoughts I have never spoken? And with each question her fear grew, until it was no longer fear, but obsession. Obsession with the tilt of his head, the depth of his stare. Obsession with the feeling that she was not the one watching him, but the one being watched, and that no one else would ever believe her. Then came the night when she woke to silence. Not the silence of sleep, but the silence of being observed. She turned, and the air in the room felt thick, her breath shallow, and she whispered into the dark, asking if someone was there. She waited, and there was no answer, only the shift of the moonlight on the wall. But when she looked back at the foot of her bed, she swore. She saw the boy not in a frame, not in paper, but standing small and pale, with his head tilted slightly to the side, as though choosing how best to see her. And when she screamed, the sound was swallowed by the house itself. Weeks later, the air around the house felt heavier than usual. The family walked with unease as though shadows lingered too long in the corners and whispers slid just out of reach. The girl had grown quieter, her eyes sunken, her words clipped. She no longer begged her parents to believe her. She no longer cried about the boy tilting his head instead. She spoke less and less, and sometimes she stood by the window staring out at the white sheet of snow, as if waiting for something, waiting for someone. And then one morning, her room was empty. Her bed was made as if by careful hands. Her shoes were neatly placed by the wall, her small possessions untouched. The only thing that broke the order was the open window, cold air pouring in the curtains, shifting in the winter. Wine, the snow outside lay smooth, unbroken. No footprints, no tracks, no sign of struggle. It was as though she had simply walked into the night without leaving a trace, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The family called the police, desperate, their voices cracking with fear. Officers searched the house, the yard, the fields beyond. They combed through the woods, their boots sinking into the snow. But nothing was found. No trail, no dropped clothing, no clue. The ground remained untouched, unmarked, as though the snow itself refused to give up its secret. And when they returned to her room, their eyes fell on the pillow. There it was, the photograph, not locked in the box, not hidden in the drawer, but resting carefully where her head should have been. The boy in the sailor suit staring outward, his lips still pressed tight, but his eyes different, no longer half-lidded, no longer weary, but wide open, wide and alive and unblinking, staring directly into anyone who dared to meet them. One officer swore he felt his chest tighten when he looked at it. He said it felt like drowning. Another refused to touch it, insisting that it radiated a presence, as if the boy inside was aware of them standing there, as if he had been waiting for them all. The mother screamed and tried to snatch the picture, but the father pulled her back, his hands trembling because deep down he feared what she feared, that the girl had not left on her own, that the photograph had taken her. The police wrote their reports. They marked the case as a disappearance, but their words were empty. They avoided mentioning the photo. They avoided describing the way it seemed to follow them with its newly opened eyes. But among themselves they whispered. They whispered that the child in the picture was not frozen, not static, but watching alive in some terrible way. The nights after her disappearance were unbearable. The family could not sleep. The mother swore she heard her daughter's voice, faint and muffled, calling. From the walls, the father sometimes caught sight of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and see nothing. The air smelled faintly of dust and cold, and every morning they found the photograph not where they had placed it, but somewhere else on the table, on the dresser, once even leaning against the window, as though the boy had been watching the snow himself. Neighbors began to keep their distance. They said they felt uneasy near the house. Children refused to go near the door, claiming they saw another child watching from the upstairs window, a child with eyes too large for his face. But when adults looked, the window was empty. Only the curtains swayed, and in the mother's dreams, the truth came clearer. She dreamt of her daughter standing at the edge of the bed, her lips moving without sound, pointing toward the photograph, and when she woke, her pillow was damp with tears she had not shed. She told her husband that their daughter was not gone. Not completely. She was inside the photo, trapped behind the paper, staring out through those wide open eyes. The father tried to burn it. He built a fire in the yard. He dropped the photograph into the flames, and for a moment it blackened, curled, the image blistered. But then the fire hissed and died, as if smothered by something unseen. When he pulled the picture back out, the boy's eyes were clearer than before, his stare sharper. His lips twisted almost imperceptibly upward, as though forming the ghost of a smile. That was when they understood the photograph was not paper. It was not ink. It was a door that had taken their daughter through and left only silence behind. The case remained unsolved. The police records gathered dust. The neighbors whispered. And years later, when the family abandoned the house, the photograph was left behind, resting again on the pillow of an empty bed, waiting, its eyes wide and unrelenting, as if searching for the next gaze, the next soul to draw in somewhere beyond the veil of snow and silence. The girl remained unseen, standing just behind the boy, her voice forever whispering to those who dare to look. He knows, he knows, he knows. A local historian became obsessed with the case after the disappearance spread through whispers and scraps of newspaper. He was the kind of man who lived among dusty records and fading ink, who knew the smell of parchment better than the smell of air. And when he first heard about the photograph, he felt the familiar stirring of curiosity. But that curiosity quickly turned into something darker. He followed the trail back through auction records, through estate sales, through private collections, until he traced it to its origin in Boston, to a name that had almost been erased from memory. A traveling photographer who had drifted through towns in the late 1800s, capturing children on glass plates and paper frames. The photographer was said to be unremarkable. Not an artist, not a man of society, but a wanderer, carrying his camera from city to city. A man who left behind no family, no fortune, only images. But when the historian finally uncovered the man's belongings after his death, a small trunk hidden in an archive, he realized the photographs were not simple mementos. They were warnings. Inside the trunk lay dozens of portraits, all of children, some sitting stiffly on chairs, some clutching dolls, some standing with nervous hands at their sides, yet every face carried the same unsettling weight. None of the children smiled, none appeared playful or light. They all stared back with eyes too serious, too intense, and in the margins of the Photographers' journals scrawled in uneven handwriting were notes that made the historian's blood run cold, refused to smile, watched me the whole time, felt wrong again and again. The same phrases as if the photographer himself had grown afraid of the subjects he was meant to capture. Page after page carried the unease, sometimes longer descriptions he would write about the silence in the room. How the air grew heavy, how the children did not blink as the long exposures dragged on. He wrote that he felt as if the children were waiting for him to finish, as if they wanted him to take the picture. Not for memory, but for some darker reason. He wrote about sweat on his palms, about the sensation of being studied, about the feeling that once he looked through the lens, the gaze that came back at him was not that of a child, but something older, something colder. And then, the most terrible discovery. The historian began to cross-reference the names and the towns listed in the journals with missing persons reports and town records, and a pattern emerged. Each child, each pale face frozen on the page, had vanished shortly after their photograph was taken. Not days, not weeks, but often within the same month. Some disappeared from their beds, some from schoolyards, some simply gone without explanation. Families, shattered communities, whispering, but no answers, and no one had ever tied the events together until now. Imagine the historian in his study late at night, the journal open on his desk, the lamplight shaking his eyes wide as he realized that he was not holding the ramblings of an eccentric, but the evidence of a trail of vanishings, a thread of darkness stitched across New England towns, and at the center of it a wandering photographer who seemed less like a man and more like a herald of something that traveled with him, something that looked through the camera each time he raised it to his eye. The historian wrote in his own notes that he felt a pressure reading the journal. He described the sensation of being watched, though he was alone. He said he sometimes saw the faces of the children staring from the edge of the lamplight, reflected in the glass of framed pictures on his walls. He said that one night, he awoke to find his own family photographs turned face down as though the eyes inside them wished to sleep. He could not shake the connection the way the children's eyes in those portraits seemed alive, and he returned again and again to the boy in the sailor suit. The same photograph that had surfaced in Vermont. The same photograph that carried the words he knows scrawled across the back. He realized that this boy was the last portrait ever taken by the photographer. The journal ended with his entry about the boy. The handwriting frantic, the lines jagged, refused to smile, watched me. The whole time felt wrong, and then the final note written in a trembling script. He knew what I was doing. The historian shut the book, trembling, but the image of that sentence lingered, burned into his thoughts. He knew what I was doing, and he began to wonder whether the photographer himself had been a victim, whether he had thought he was capturing children, when in truth he was opening something. Darker a doorway with every click of the shutter, every flash of light. Perhaps the lens did not preserve life but trapped it, and perhaps the boy in the sailor suit had not been taken, but had taken something for himself. Rumors grew that the historian never finished his research, that his notes ended abruptly, just like the journal he had studied. Some say he locked the photograph away in an archive box, never to be opened again. Others say he disappeared, leaving only the journal open on his desk, and the words he knows written again and again across the margins in his own hand, and the portraits. The dozens of stiff, unsmiling children they scattered into collections, into attics, into forgotten trunks, waiting silent with their unblinking eyes, staring out through the years, and those who stumble upon them even now speak of the same sensation of being watched, of being measured, and they whisper the same question the historian once whispered in terror. What did those children know, and why did they refuse to smile? From Boston to Vermont, the disappearances spread like a stain across the map. Small towns, cities, farmhouses, boarding houses, each left with a hollow in their history. A child gone and a photograph left behind. It was as if the photographer carried something with him, something unseen that lingered in his camera, in the plates, in the dark cloth he pulled over his head when he worked. People later spoke of how he moved quietly through their towns, how he seemed almost invisible, except for the way children noticed him first. They said the children would stop in their play and watch him with strange stillness, as if they already knew they were waiting for him. The historian traced the trail town by town, and the pattern grew undeniable. Each disappearance mirrored the last. First the arrival of the photographer, then the sitting where the child was posed carefully, sometimes with a toy, sometimes with a book, always stiff, always unsmiling, always those same eyes staring into the lens. And then within weeks, sometimes days, the child would vanish, leaving behind confusion, grief and fear, and always a photograph tucked away in a drawer, in a frame on a mantel. The same expression, the same strange gaze. The parents often said they felt uneasy about the photograph. Some burned them, some buried them. Yet even when destroyed, the photographs seemed to surface again in unexpected places. An attic, a trunk, a second-hand shop, as if they refused to be lost, as if something inside them resisted being forgotten, and the children who stared from those frames did not seem preserved in innocence. They seemed alive in a way that made onlookers uneasy, as though the life inside had not been captured, but contained. Those who studied the photographs said the style was unmistakable, the same framing, the same flat background, the same rigid posture. Yet it was not the style that haunted them. It was the eyes. Every child looked outward, not into the camera, not at the photographer, but through it. And what unsettled observers most was the sense that the gaze was not of the moment the child sat. It was of something older, something looking from beyond the image through the glass outward at whoever held it. There were whispers in Boston that the photographer had once studied under men who believed cameras could capture more than light and shadow, that the lens could draw out the soul, that a photograph could hold more than a likeness it could hold, a presence, a memory, a fragment of life. And whether he believed it or not, whether he practiced it or not, the evidence lay in the trail he left behind. Because with each photograph, a child disappeared, as though the picture had not preserved them, but consumed them. When the historian laid the photographs side by side on his table, he noticed something even more disturbing. The faces, though belonging to different children, different towns, seemed to share an echo. The curve of the lips, the depth of the eyes, the set of the jaw, all carried a familiarity, as if each child was slowly becoming the same face, the same expression staring outward at him. And he wrote in his notes that he felt they were merging that with each picture. The boy in the sailor suit grew clearer, more defined, as though every photograph was feeding into him. Neighbors from Vermont recalled that before the farmhouse collapsed, they had seen a strange figure in the upper windows, a small silhouette framed against the curtains, though the family swore no one was there. They spoke of hearing laughter, faint and distant, though no child was inside. And when the house finally fell, the photograph remained untouched, waiting at the bottom of that box as though guarding the brittle letters and broken toys. The trail stretched further than anyone wanted to admit. Whispers of similar disappearances in Connecticut and New York and Pennsylvania, always with the same clue left behind. A photograph, stiff, lifeless, yet alive, and in everyone the same eyes, not eyes of fear, not eyes of innocence, but eyes of something peering outward, searching, measuring, choosing. The historian wrote that he feared the pattern was not finished, that the trail was not a line drawn in the past, but a path still moving forward. He feared the photographs were not relics, but beacons, that they were watching for new eyes to meet theirs, and he confessed in his private notes that he could no longer keep them in his study. He locked them away in a vault, yet even in sleep he felt them pressing on his mind, pressing until he dreamt of children standing at the foot of his bed, silent, unsmiling, watching him, and always the boy in the sailor suit at the center of them, all his head tilting, his lips pressed tight, his eyes staring outward, not inward, never inward, as though something behind him, something ancient and unseen, had leaned close and was looking out through his small face, through his black and white eyes, waiting for someone, new to meet the gaze, and those who dared to meet it never stayed the same. Whispers spread that the photographer hadn't been capturing children at all, that the lens had been a doorway trapping something inside each photograph. And in the boy's case, the thing inside wasn't finished. In 2003, a collector bought the photograph at an estate sale. He displayed it in his study. Within a week, he told friends he felt followed in his own house. The night before he died, he called 911 and said a child was knocking on his walls. Police found him slumped at his desk, the photograph in his lap. Today, that same photo circulates online. People claim the eyes are not always the same. Some see them shut, some half open, some glaring directly at the viewer. And a few insist the boy's face smiles faintly now. Historians agree the child in the photo was never identified. No name, no record, just the picture. But the strange thing is this: everyone who has owned the photograph has either disappeared or died mysteriously. And still, the photo always turns up again. So if you see it, and if you feel the boy's eyes following you, don't stare too long, because the last thing you want is for him to finally blink.